Hey, what's going on, church? We wanted to recap our message from this past week. You know, the last couple of weeks we've been talking about conflict in the church, the Jerusalem Council, and dealing with all the issues of circumcision and following the law of Moses. We kind of recapped that last week. But this week we were looking at a personal conflict that happened between Paul and Barnabas. Now, these two guys have been ministering together for a long time. A lot of people don't realize the church is several decades old at this point. When the Jerusalem Council happened, we think it was about year 35 of the church. And so the church is probably a few more years advanced at this point. Now, Paul and Barnabas have been ministering together for a long time. Paul says, hey, Barnabas, let's go revisit all the churches that we helped and established, and let's encourage the brothers. He wants to retrace his steps on the first missionary trip, and Barnabas goes, yeah, that's great, but I want to take John Mark. Now, you remember Mark. He was the one that abandoned them on the first missionary trip. He got cold feet. It got hard. He got soft. We don't know all the details. He could have got homesick. Something happened, and Mark went home. And here Barnabas is keeping with his character. Barnabas is a great encourager. He's one who wants to restore. He did this for Paul, himself. And so he's one who wants to give people great grace. And he says, let's bring along John Mark. Paul doesn't think that's such a good idea. We don't know everything that was said, but we do know that they had a sharp dispute, a sharp disagreement between the two of them. So Barnabas decides to take Mark in this issue, and they set sail for Cyprus. And Paul takes Silas with him, and he goes into Syria, and they start up into Turkey to retrace their steps there and to visit the churches there. Now, this is a big disagreement. We don't know all the details here. However, we do know some details. We do know that these two men had a great love and respect for each other, and even though they sharply disagreed right here, they did not build their ministries on tearing the other one down, which is something that is tremendously admirable of these two. We do know that God used this disagreement for the furtherance of His kingdom. Instead of one powerhouse ministry team, we now have two. Instead of just Paul and Barnabas, we now have young proteges in the mix. Barnabas takes John Mark. We know John Mark has a proven ministry after this, and God uses him in extraordinary ways. But Barnabas takes Silas, who is also a wonderful minister of the gospel, and Paul takes Silas, and then he goes into Lystra and picks up Timothy. And we see these young leaders being brought to the table. And there's a lot for us to learn here about conflict. Sometimes we're just going to have to agree to disagree when it comes to relational conflict. And sometimes we're just going to have to take a break right then and there. But we can trust that God is using that disagreement, that rift, for His good. Now, we're not going to bash the other people, but this is also something that we can look and we can go, hey, how is God bringing new leaders up, new leaders into the church? One of the death sentences of a church is, well, that's the way we've always done it, with the people we've always done it with. And we always rely on the same people to do the same jobs over and over again. And sometimes we need to look for where we can share the load with people, where we can give away ministry. And we need to look for those Timothys and those John Marks and how we can build them up. Now, the result of this, I want you to see, the result of this in chapter 16 was that the church was strengthened. Now, they went around and they're sharing the letter from the Jerusalem Council. They're sharing what was decided, the things we talked about last week, but the church is strengthened through all of this, and the church is growing in faith, and it says their numbers increased daily. Now, this is important because Paul and Barnabas, they kept the mission first and foremost. They didn't get into, they got into their squabble, but they didn't let their squabble define their ministry. Either one of them. They weren't tearing each other down. They weren't making it all about themselves. We know that from how Paul wrote to the early churches. He says it's not about Paul, it's not about Peter, it's not about Apollos. And you can include Barnabas in that as well. But we do know the New Testament does kind of show us that Paul and Barnabas had a mutual respect, and I believe there was a reconciliation. Paul always spoke very high of Barnabas in his letters, and he spoke high of John Mark as well. In fact, in his letter to Timothy, he encourages Timothy to bring John Mark, and that John Mark was a tremendous help to him and needed in his ministry. And so that's encouraging to see that Paul did not harbor these ill feelings towards Barnabas or towards John Mark. And there's a lesson in there for all of us. Now, if you're watching this in a life group, there's absolutely these questions that we want you to go through, questions that are crafted around this sermon, and you can talk about those in your group. We encourage you to do so because that group environment is where we really grow in our faith. But if you're just watching this on your own, I really want you to think about your relationship rifts, those disagreements, how we deal with conflict. It's not a matter of if we'll deal with conflict, if we'll disagree with people. It's kind of a matter of when and how we deal with that, taking the higher road, empowering new leaders underneath us, and not poisoning them. Paul did not poison Timothy towards Barnabas, and Barnabas did not poison John Mark toward Paul. That's an awesome attribute. That is a beautiful thing, all for the greater mission, which is something we need to keep at the forefront of all of our thought. It's a theme of the book of Acts. The mission of the gospel moving forward and the unity of the church was very important to these guys, and it was more important than their personal issues. So talk about these questions in your group. If you're with a group, think about these things if you're on your own, and we'll catch you next Sunday for church at 10 o'clock.